And DaySim inputs, we talked about it generally, but the DaySim inputs, they need to be in a specific format. And inside the DaySim inputs directory, you would find 9 or 10 subfolders, which clearly, which are labeled as per the, the input files that should be within them. And in general, DaySim inputs, they include, the mass data, node to node distance file, synthetic population. Then there are things like, how many workers in each zone have their work location outside the model region. There is a TAS index file where you indicate, which zones out of which zones are external zones and things like that. And then PNR nodes, and then DaySim coefficients is another input, the coefficients for various models. And then there is something called roster and roster combination files. This is something specific to DaySim. So a roster file is where you would define, all the skims that needs to be used for each mode. For each period, you can do that. And then roster combination, the combination between modes and paths in DaySim. So we are not going to cover all the DaySim settings in much detail, but if you are interested, you can go to DaySim user guide, which might provide you more information with what exactly these files are and how you can configure them. And then another input to DaySim are the skims. Those skims also, they need to be in a specific format. So the skims from Visum are formatted in the format required for DaySim. I think it's a text format, and they're all of this happens automatically, but this is just to give an idea about what are the different types of inputs that need to be prepared for DaySim to run. And then there is a DaySim configuration file, and there is also a seat shadow file. So DaySim runs shadow pricing for work and school location. And for those of you coming from a trip-based model background, the shadow pricing in ABM is something similar to, double constraining a gravity model. So it's like you want to make sure that your jobs, number of jobs and number of workers in each zone sort of match. So that's what shadow pricing does. Okay, so those are DaySim inputs, and then all the other inputs, which include the land use data, network, transit line, and various miscellaneous inputs for auxiliary models or settings and other things. Everything else is stored in the Visum version file. And among the DaySim inputs, some of the inputs are sort of fixed. The ones that are grayed out, they are sort of fixed and do not vary between various scenarios. But the first three, which is land use data and synthetic population and all of that gets generated by DaySim tools and population sim. And then the skims and DaySim configuration files, these are exported from Visum. And the shadow pricing file is again, it's generated by DaySim itself. So when you're setting up a model for a new region, or if you have made significant changes to your inputs, then you got to run DaySim in shadow pricing mode, where it runs 10 iterations of shadow pricing and generates a shadow pricing file, which get used for all the subsequent runs. So since all these tools, they work in tandem to produce inputs for DaySim and other model processes. So it'll be good to know how the data workflow happens in NERPMAB and how these tools interact with each other. So let's quickly look at this flowchart sort of tries to explain that workflow. And it starts with all the mass data that's in Visum, and there's a Python process which exports the mass data in Visum, and the exported mass data gets used to update population sim inputs. So let's say if you're running the model for 2045, so this would export 2045 data, and then it would update the population sim controls and scale them as per 2045 land use data. And then it would run population sim and then convert it into DaySim format and and provide synthetic population for DaySim. Now, on the other side, the exported mass data also get used by the DaySim tools. And DaySim tools, in conjunction with other inputs for that tools, such as all street networks, run network data prep, DTN, buffering, and then it produces land use data for DaySim. And as I mentioned before, the version file doesn't include TAS data. The TAS data get aggregated from the mass data, and then it also gets updated based on the synthetic population and the land use data, and then that gets exported to be used by auxiliary models. So normally you would not have to worry about how the data workflow or how these tools are interacting with each other, because all of this happens automatically behind the scenes. But it's good to know the dependencies. So for example, all these tools, they need not be run every time you run the model. So for example, population sim needs to be run only once for a typical use, and only unless you are changing the land use data in any way, then you would need to rerun population sim. But then one thing to note here is, let's say if you're skipping population sim, then you need to know if are there any other processes that depends on population sim inputs, and if yes, then you might need to run population sim. Or if you're let's say updating the mass data, then what processes are dependent on mass data update. So population sim and DaySim data rules both are dependent on mass data. So if you make changes to your mass data, both of these would need to be rerun. But within mass data also, there are certain variables that do not affect DaySim tools or population sim. So for example, if you're updating the employment data, then only DaySim data tool need to be updated. But since employment is not a control in population sim, it need not be rerun. And again, you need not worry about how to what processes needs to be run when you make a specific input change. We have created specific procedure sequences that you need to run after a specific input change, and I'll talk more about those in tomorrow's session when we work through some of the scenarios where we would update land use data or change geography or anything. So you'll get to know more about that tomorrow. But this is just for your information, so that you know how the data workflow happens, what are the dependencies. So in future, if you are going to make any significant change, you should know how each tool interact with each other. Okay, so this in this last section, we'll quickly go over model settings. And the NERPM, there are different settings in NERPMAB, and you would find them in different locations. So first is the general model settings, and you will find them in a user-defined table. So let me close this. Let's go to lists, user defined tables, and then you can go to table entries. Click on that. It opens a table entry window, and by default it shows, I think it generally shows you the first table in the list of tables. So the general model settings are in the settings user defined table. So you can select settings and then say confirm selection, click on that, and then it would open these for you. And these are general model settings. So these would include things like scenario directory. So let's say if you're running the base 2015 scenario, so this needs to be the name of that scenario folder that we looked at. If you're running a CF 2045 scenario, then the scenario directory would need to be updated. And there are things like DaySim run type. So I talked about generating shadow price. So if you want to generate shadow price, you would instead of regular, you would change this to shadow price, and then DaySim will run in the shadow pricing mode, and it would generate shadow prices. And then there are other things like the model year. These are beginning time bins for the 4 aggregate periods. So DaySim produces trip list for 24-hour period, but then those need to be aggregated to 4 time periods for assignment. So this is where those settings are defined. And then there are other settings like occupancy rates, how many zones are there, and and then for the various auxiliary models, there are settings like fraction of trucks for various period, and then attraction balance factor, and so on. Okay, and then here at the very bottom, you would see there are a few more DaySim settings relating to shadow pricing. So the name of the shadow pricing file, and then also number of shadow pricing iterations that you want to run if you're running DaySim in shadow pricing mode. Okay, so those are the general settings. And then the next is DaySim specific settings. And these you can find again, go back to the same user defined table window, and then click here if you want to look at a new table. And this time let's go to, let me just expand this a little bit so that you can see the whole name. So there are 2 DaySim configuration files. There is a regular DaySim, and then there is a DaySim config shadow price. So if you want to make changes to a regular DaySim run, you would open the DaySim config file. But if you want to make changes to the shadow pricing mode of DaySim, then that is where you would go. The settings are slightly different in shadow pricing because you're not, first of all, you would not be running all the models when you're running DaySim and shadow pricing. It only runs the location choice models really. And but in a regular run, all the models are run, meaning starting from auto ownership all the way to mode choice and trip mode choice. But for now, let's quickly look at DaySim config file. And then this includes all the DaySim specific configuration settings. And normally for typical model run, you would not need to come here to change anything. The only thing that you might change on a regular basis, or that you might change ever, is this setting on row 96, which is end processors. So this define the number of cores on your machine that DaySim will use. So if you have more logical cores available on your machine, you can increase this number, and that would make DaySim to run faster, and you can achieve faster run times. But all other settings pretty much remain the same, unless you are designing a scenario which requires you to change some specific settings, like path impedances, or if you want to play with random seed for micro simulation. So all those things can be updated here. And when the model is run, this table gets exported to the let me go to the directory structure here. So, and we looked at DaySim inputs. Okay, let me try to make this a little bigger. Okay, so the configuration file, wherever it needs to go, it the Visum exports this table in the right format for DaySim to use. All right, so let's go back here. So there are general settings, and then DaySim configuration. And then the third type of settings are the general procedure settings. And to access those, there are multiple ways to access those settings. You can either go to calculate menu and then click on general procedure settings. Or if you already have your procedure sequence window open, you can click on this box here, and that would also open the general procedure settings. So what's included in general procedure settings? More settings related to operations within Visum, assignment, skimming, and things like that. So if you want to define, your volume delay functions, and then you can assign volume delay functions to specific link types. You can define impedance for skimming assignment, and then there are some specific assignment settings, and skims, and what to do with for the diagonals of skims, and units for skims and things like that. And same for public transport side as well, again, assignment and skims and all that. So if you want to change any of or configure any of those settings, you can always access them from the general procedure settings in the procedure sequence window. Okay, so and the last set of settings are mode step configuration. So in the procedure sequence for each step, there are settings that you might have to update. So let's say if I open the skimming step operation here. So here you might have to select, what type of skims to generate, and what is the criteria for searching path and things like that. So those are, and again, this is also something you would not have to change for a typical model use, but this is just for your information to know. In case if you want to change any of these settings, you can find them, access them from within procedure sequence. And then lastly, we did talk a lot about individual tools. So all of those individual tools, they have their own settings and configuration file. Population sim has its own settings. DaySim buffering tool has its own settings and configuration files. So if there is a need where you, for example, if you want to model a scenario where the population demographics are changing in some way, so you would go to population sim settings and make changes accordingly. But the tools settings are defined in their specific tools directory. So whenever you have opened the version file, when you're done with making changes to your model, if you're making changes to the inputs or updating any settings or any change that you make, always save the version file, and you can come to file and then do save as. If you want to save it as a under a different name, you can do that. And it's always recommended that you as keep saving as you go along, and don't wait to the very end to save your work, but keep saving as you keep working through your updates and changes.